Hello music fans, welcome to Death by Unicorn. This is my top 10 favorite metal, rock, and prog albums of 1984. I've done 1980 through 1983 recently. I'm continuing my series here. Check out the other videos on my channel for those other years if you haven't seen them already. And hit that like and subscribe if you want to support what I'm doing here and stay in the loop on when the next video is coming out. Without further ado, before I jump into my top 10, I'm just going to give a quick few honorable mentions here. Like in my last video, I'm going to give a couple honorable mentions to Rick Wakeman. He released some music here in 1984. Beyond the Planets by Rick Wakeman, Jeff Wayne, and Kevin Peake. This is more of a classical piece with some progressive rock influences. It's a collaborative album between these three musicians where they adapt the classical piece called The Planets by Gustav Holst and bring more of a modern progressive rock and synthesizer flavor to it. It's really fun to listen to. Rick Wakeman also did a soundtrack for a movie called Crimes of Passion. This is the soundtrack to a thriller that I've never seen. I usually don't really listen to or like soundtracks that much, but I always have to make an exception when I see it's done by Rick Wakeman. So I checked this out and it's actually pretty cool. Four more quick honorable mentions to talk about. War and Pain by Voivod. Voivod's a nice, eclectic, unique thrash metal band with a lot of progressive tendencies. So they're always interesting to listen to. And then a couple by Mike Oldfield, Discovery and The Killing Fields, which is also a soundtrack. These aren't his best work or anything, but it's always interesting to hear what Mike Oldfield is up to. And the last honorable mention that I want to mention is Stationary Traveler by Camel. This is a progressive rock album. It's their 10th album. It's a concept album like a lot of Camel's work. This one centers on the trials of East German refugees attempting to cross the Berlin Wall from East Berlin into West Berlin. All right, with the honorable mentions out of the way, let's get into the top 10 proper with number 10, which is The Warning by Queensryche. This is heavy metal with power metal and progressive influences. It's their debut album. Arguably, it's among the first, if not the very first, progressive metal album of all time, unless you count some stuff like King Crimson, which isn't really metal, or Black Sabbath, which isn't really prog, or Rush, which I wouldn't really say is that metal, or Deep Purple, not really metal, Judas Priest, not really prog, and Iron Maiden, not really that prog. So if you don't count any of those, I'd say this is probably the first prog metal album, although it did come out the same month as the debut Fates Warning album, Night on Brocken. But I do think this Queensryche album is slightly more progressive and better than that Fates Warning album. However, it's hard to call this definitive prog metal because it's not too proggy. It still leans more towards a heavy metal sound like Iron Maiden, but just has some more proggy moments than you'd get with Black Sabbath, Deep Purple, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden up to this point in time. Number 9, I have Grace Under Pressure by Rush. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Rush got really high up in my lists so far to this point. So them being at number 9 is kind of a blow, but that's just, I just don't love Grace Under Pressure as much as I've loved everything they've done up until this point. It's still a progressive rock album, but they've brought in a lot more of the new wave influences. It's their 10th album. Still a very good album, but for me, unfortunately, this is where Rush starts going a bit downhill after they released 9 nearly flawless albums in a row. Now, number 8 is Fugazi by Marillion. This is a neo-prog album. It's got some hard rock influences. It's their second album, and it's a very enjoyable one. So definitely check out Fugazi by Marillion. And number 7 is Ammonia Avenue by the Alan Parsons Project. This is progressive rock. It's got some pop and new wave influences as well. It's their 7th album. Kind of like easy listening AOR progressive rock. Most normal people can listen to this album by the Alan Parsons Project and they wouldn't be weirded out or anything. It's very straightforward, very catchy. The production and performances are great as always. Number 6 is Perfect Strangers by Deep Purple. This is hard rock with heavy metal influences. My favorite tracks on here are Perfect Strangers and Hungry Days. but really it's a solid album from start to end. Number 5 is Ride the Lightning by Metallica. This is thrash metal. It's their second album. I think they improved from their first album by bringing in more variety with adding some acoustic guitars. Every song on here is great. For Whom the Bell Tolls is one of the more memorable ones on here. I like how it's followed by Fade to Black, which is their first kind of power ballad song. And I like how the album ends with an instrumental, The Call of Cthulhu. Number 4 is Flexible by Steve Vai. This is experimental progressive rock. It's his debut album. Lots of great guitar shredding and instrumental songs on here, but also some songs with vocals. There's a lot of humor and quirkiness on here. It's a very interesting listen. I think when some people hear the name Steve Vai, they just assume it's kind of like instrumental guitar shredding music. But this one is quirky, weird. It's got vocals. There's a lot of like funny songs and kind of weird sounds and kind of reminiscent of like the quirkiness of Frank Zappa. So definitely check it out if you're into that. Number 3 is Power Slave by Iron Maiden. This is heavy metal. It's their 5th album. It features the hit 2 Minutes to Midnight. My favorite tracks on here are Flash of the Blade and then the epic album closer, Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which is 13 minutes and 45 seconds long, and it's kind of progressive. So this could be an early example of progressive metal as well. Iron Maiden, unlike Queensryche, they don't tend to stay progressive for like a lot of songs on the album. At this point in their career, they would have like one kind of progressive-y song on their album. So I hesitate to call Power Slave a progressive metal album, but they are kind of pioneering that sound on a track or two here and there in their career at this point. Number 2 is Defenders of the Faith by Judas Priest. This is another heavy metal album. It's their 9th album. It features the hits Free Will Burning, Some Heads Are Gonna Roll, and Love Bites. All great songs. Every song on here is solid. This is probably my 3rd favorite Judas Priest album at this point in time, after my favorite, which is 1990's Painkiller, and then 1976's Sad Wings of Destiny. My number 3 right now at this point in time is Defenders of the Faith by Judas Priest. And then my number 1 album of 1984 is Three of a Perfect Pair by King Crimson. This is progressive rock with new wave, post-punk, and industrial influences. It's their 10th album. And it's about time King Crimson get my number 1 spot in one of these lists. This is their first number 1 in the 80s, and I think when I did my series on the 70s, they had maybe one number 1, I think was what they had. Yeah, I think so. Anyway, they're a great band. They deserve all the praise. I know a lot of people don't really love this era of King Crimson and don't really love Three of a Perfect Pair. And they prefer the other eras over the Adrian Belew stuff, but I actually really love this era. I love the Adrian Belew led King Crimson. It's my favorite. He's my favorite King Crimson vocalist, not necessarily because he's the best singer, but just because he brings that weirdness, that quirkiness that I talked about that Steve Vai brings. It's reminiscent of Frank Zappa. Adrian Belew brings that too. I think those guys both played with Frank Zappa, so they learned some pretty cool stuff from him. So check out Three of a Perfect Pair by King Crimson. And that's it for my 10 favorite albums of 1984. What are your favorites? Let me know down in the comments. And what do you think of my list? And stay tuned for my next video in this series, which will be on 1985. Not sure if I'll be posting that right away tomorrow, as I know I want to listen to the Eson album. I want to be listening to, what else? Eson, See You Next Tuesday, Einar Solberg, Steve Hackett, The Aristocrats, and Eternal Storm. So I'm going to be busy. That might even take me a couple days to really digest all of those albums and get my first impressions. So that's what I'll be doing. Maybe I'll be taking a little break from this top albums of the 80s while I check out those albums. Or maybe I'll just push through and talk about 1985 very soon. We'll see. It'll depend on my mood. Until then, peace out. Stay tuned.